to the television news cameras and reporters, and the next day is shocked to find himself quoted in his local paper and even in an Associated Press item about the bombing that runs in the New York Times. And for several days, Lee is an unexpected, to him, celebrity in his town, awash in the sympathy of his neighbors and colleagues. All of this unexpected and not entirely unpleasant to him. What he doesn't realize is that the attention has also made him of particular interest to the FBI investigators who've arrived in town to investigate his colleague Hendley's murder. And that interest of theirs leads to disastrous results, which many of you know about because you've read the book. I'm so used to trying to stoke interest in cold-hearted readers who haven't read my book and who are weighing whether or not to buy it. Before, however, Lee realizes precisely how interesting he is to the FBI, he decides to mow his lawn. And that's the second passage I'll read. Eileen, who he mentions or thinks of, is his ex-wife, now dead, and Esther, as you know, is his grown daughter. That afternoon, Lee changed into old slacks and a T-shirt and wrestled his ancient push mower out into the sun. He hated lawn mowing. It offered none of the pleasures of plant tending and 10 times the toil, but he also hated to pay for it, and the infrequency with which he did it had long ago set his lawn on the path of dereliction, so that his reluctance to mow was complicated by guilt, which only made him stall further. Even after resolving to mow, he found much to derail him. There was, for a start, the disgraceful condition of his mower, with its deathbed repertoire of labored drones, its concealed set of loose nut maracas, its juddering blade, and its dried algal scum of the dead sod of ages gone by. Add the clumsy lashing motion required to yank-start the engine, and the geriatric gasping unleashed, and, once the mowing began, the law of contrasts by which a shave for the lawn cast in glaring relief the shagginess of the flowers and shrubs. At least there were few witnesses. The generic children of his nearby neighbors must all still be in school. No scuffed plastic big wheels or tasseled tricycles or banana seat training-wheeled bikes were being pedaled in driveways. The elaborate cedar play fortress of his right-hand neighbor was abandoned, its turrets and drawbridges noiselessly soaking up sun. At the moment, no paired female walkers were huffing past, with pert, ponytailed hair and clenched fists. Lee sometimes was shown the raised hand or quick smile of the walker whose habit it was to greet all human beings this way. He didn't know names, nor did he give much thought to these reflexive acknowledgments. They were just part of the life of a smallish American town. As he finished the very thin strip to the left of his driveway, which he always did first for the quick, easy sense of accomplishment, the lone howl of his mower was joined by another commotion. His across-the-street neighbor's small house, the same model as his, just a little too much for an old man entirely alone, and just barely enough for a couple with a toddler and baby, briefly quaked, then erupted, some restraint overcome. The resident toddler rushed out the front door, shrieking and naked except for a diaper, and disappeared around the side of the house, with the mother and a hip-riding baby in awkward pursuit. Lee didn't know the name of the toddler or even its sex, but now that he thought about it, plodding with his slight weight pressed forward against the machine, he recalled that for the past several weeks there was scarcely a day this scene wasn't enacted. The child must have just learned to walk, or to open the front door, or both. What would that be? 14 months? That was the age Esther had been when she'd worn her first shoes. The three of them had lived on Sawyer Street then, in a part of town now entirely different. For one thing, entirely black. Lee hadn't been there in years, not even to trawl the now broken streets for his best memories. But Sawyer Street existed without flaw in his mind. Their very first house, their beachhead as a new family. He and Eileen had been married 4 years. He'd had his doctorate for 1. Esther was going on 1.5. They'd had a little metal stroller for Esther that compared with the strollers of today was as crude as a Ford Model T, but Lee had approved of its ungainly weight. Perhaps because he was pushing a rolling thing now, leaned at such a sharp angle for progress that he might appear to be walking into a stiff wind, this recollection of pushing Esther overtook him completely. It fell onto him like a cloak, and now the breeze on his bare arms was balmy and sweet, and the sun had dropped off the zenith and blunted its rays. It was early morning, and his brown hands were wrapped confidently around the twin rubber handles, and he saw his smooth knees and his tan, slender shins, and the toes of his leather sandals, always almost stubbed on the stroller's big wheels. With Esther, he also leaned forward, pushed the thing with his body aslant to avoid this annoyance. A posture he dimly realized was in some way female. All the strollers were misdesigned, though at the time no one called it a flaw. It was how strollers were, the handles rising straight from the rear wheels so that you had to lean forward to not stub your toes. And this was the profile of all the neighborhood's women, and it was also Lee's profile. And he didn't mind this self-feminization. In fact, he secretly liked it. Esther sitting very erect in her low-riding seat, often banging the palm of one hand on the metal restraint bar as if urging a horse to speed up. This gesture was very peremptory. It allowed of no doubt that the order would be promptly obeyed. And Lee always had his gaze trained on the crown of her head, on her very dark, yet also wonderfully soft, wispy hair, which curled outward in all directions in contradictory wavelets. Eileen's hair was wavy that way, but entirely different in color, a very pale brown, while Lee's hair was typically Asian, the color of Esther's, but straight as a broom, so that Esther's was a miracle blending of Lee and Eileen. "It's not so astounding," Eileen once remarked. "All babies have very soft hair. Yours was probably like that." In other words, Esther's hair was like Lee's, and Eileen had no part in it. Why had she said this? Lee pushed harder, surged more powerfully through his forearms, and as if in response to the increase in speed, Esther raised an arm over her head. "Ya, ya, ya," Esther yelled. The asphalt was smooth, the street recent, all the aluminum-clad little houses proudly tended, still new. In this scene, Lee is, as in every scene of his life prior and subsequent, a novelty. But the novelty of his novelty here is how well people like him. They might see him as an anomaly, a suburban Yul Brynner with his vague provenance and his careful English, but they also see a devoted father, and they embrace him. Esther's perfect happiness at this age is confirmed on all sides. She sleeps soundly, eats like a wolf, and now walks on small, powerful legs. She isn't yet old enough to perceive the cross currents of tension, even of misery, that are already warping the walls of the Sawyer Street house. And maybe Lee isn't old enough either, though he's older than all of his neighbors by a decade or more, the father of a toddler, his first child, and he's already 40. Yet he feels fantastically young, or is it that for the first time in life he feels optimistic? He yelped at a terrible noise, something violently hacked as the handle leaped out of his hands. There was a double instant, Esther's small, compact weight torn from him. He was practically fainting on top of the mower, the blade fearsomely gnashing, but he'd only run over a branch.